But I think we both know what men are like.
Kubrick was to film what Einstein was to physics. He was a man who changed things by transcendent thinking. You know, he seemed to be working on a level beyond what other directors were doing.
He was technically absolutely amazing and always on the lookout for the new way of doing things. And subsequently, he has, of course, influenced many, many, many filmmakers.
Little pigs, let me come in. Not by the hair on your chinny chin chin.
Almost every director that's making great films today was influenced, inspired, or began their careers as a result of Stanley Kubrick's work. So he's shaped contemporary cinema in a way that it's so natural now we don't necessarily notice.
Hello there, soldier. Ready to kill more Germans?
Yes, sir.
What's your name, soldier?
Sir, Private for Royal Company A.
Uh-huh. You married, Private?
No, sir.
Well, I'll bet your mother's proud of you.
Yes, sir.
Well, carry on, Private, and good luck to you.
Yes, sir. Thank you, sir.
In every way, he was an innovative director. His camera, his editing style, everything about his films was innovative and interesting.
Soon there was no court in Europe where he and the Chevalier were not received. And they were speedily in the very best society, where play was patronized and professors of that science always welcome.
They were always about the journey of a human being from one place to another and how they got there in the midst of big events. And the genius of Kubrick is that he was able to put that story into motion pictures that were commercial and that were also innovative. And I don't think anyone's ever been able to combine all three of those things.
Stanley Kubrick was born in New York City in 1928. He grew up in the West Bronx, where one of his earliest passions was going to see baseball games at the nearby Yankee Stadium.
His father was a doctor who was determined to make the most of his son's talents, but his son wasn't really very good at school. Stanley never took the academic life very seriously.
Growing up, Stanley had a very high IQ, but he was not academic. He didn't respond well to teaching. He was shy, he was withdrawn, quite often skipped school to go to the cinema. His father was quite anxious about this and tried to intervene in his life quite a lot. At one point, he sent him off to Pasadena to live with an uncle for a year in the hope that that might break him out of his shell. He tried a lot of things, but he didn't really hit pay dirt until he gave Stanley a camera at the age of 13.
Jacques Kubrick was an avid photographer himself and took many home films, so there was sort of camera work in the household. And Jacques presented to his son a Gravlex camera. Now, a Gravlex camera is quite an old-fashioned camera, certainly at that time, and quite heavy. If you wear them around your neck, they sort of come down to your navel, and it's quite, you can't sort of take a photo up here, you have to take a photograph down here. And much of the kind of Kubrick style, if you look at it later on in life, is low-level shots, you know, shots that almost ground level, that may well have stemmed from the fact that his first imagery always came from his navel. You looked down into the camera and you saw it along that way, or you looked up. So the camera was kind of quite important. The other thing his father did was he introduced him to chess. And chess seemed to be, I don't know, the key that kind of unlocked the door that Stanley had hidden behind. He loved this idea that it was dueling, it was competition between people. He loved this concept that you planned ahead, you meticulously thought out your moves, and there was one right move. It was a way of looking into the future and almost fixing it.
Kubrick would attempt to make a career out of his twin passions of chess and photography. He would play games of chess for money around New York City, whilst at the same time building up his catalogue of photographs.
Stanley Kubrick didn't get into university. His grades weren't good enough, and there were a lot of GIs coming back from the Second World War, so competition was high for a university place. So he decided to pursue photography, paying for it by playing chess. He would just walk around New York all day, taking pictures anywhere and everywhere he could, and his neighbour had a darkroom, so Stanley would then go and watch the pictures develop and understand the process of image making. And he spent a long time honing his craft.
On the day that Roosevelt died, the young Stanley Kubrick was walking through the streets and came across a news vendor. And famously, Kubrick took this snapshot, this fantastic encapsulation of a moment. At that time, news magazines, photographic magazines were very, very big, such as Life and its sister magazine, Look. So in went this 16-year-old, 17-year-old Stanley Kubrick. Helen O'Brien, who was the photographic editor of Look at the time, had a policy of always looking at a photo. No matter who brought it in, she would look at it. And he proudly displayed this picture of a news vendor and Roosevelt's death. And she knew it was a good photo and offered $25 for this photograph.
It wasn't long before they could see that he had something interesting, and they took him on board. He became an associate for Look. He became one of their photographers. And he specialized in creating photographic narratives. He would do little series of pictures, not just one-offs, but he'd go down to the streets of Manhattan or wherever it was, and he'd find something interesting or an interesting personality, and then take several shots of them in various modes or conditions, so that by the end of it, once he'd kind of narrowed down the pictures to maybe a dozen or possibly 16, what he'd done was he'd photographed a story. He'd created a narrative. I think this is where Kubrick's filmmaking disciplines and his ideas begin.
One of Kubrick's assignments for Look magazine was called Day of the Fight, where he followed the boxer Walter Cartier throughout a full day as he prepared for a fight that evening. He soon decided to return to the subject for his first attempt at documentary filmmaking.
So with his own money and using his friends, Kubrick wanted to turn his sort of photographic reportage into a moving picture. And The Day of the Fight became an actual film. He used sort of something like $4,000, I think, to make it. And he would actually produce this rather tremendous little bit of work, really influential in terms of how he shot the boxing and how he kind of pictured the life. And he would eventually sell it to RKO Pictures, who were very much in the market for these short films. And they would put it out next to, I think, some kind of Robert Mitchum thriller it went out with. But Kubrick says, as soon as he sat down in the cinema and he saw his moving images up there on the screen, that was that. That was his life work, that was the way he was going to be, that was what he wanted to do. He went on to be commissioned by RKO to do other small documentaries, one including a priest called the Flying Padre, who basically had such a big diocese that he had to fly from church to give masses, and there was Kubrick kind of going along with him, filming this kind of life. And already you were starting to see sort of small tracking shots and unusual angles, and he was sort of playing around with the format. So he came back from this kind of period of making documentaries and thought, well, I'm going to sort of jettison the photography and become a filmmaker, and then set about thinking, well, what kind of feature film can I make?
Kubrick's first feature, Fear and Desire, essentially was funded by his family. His uncle, the guy who he'd gone to stay with in Pasadena, and his father both put up funds. The budget's roughly $10,000, which in today's money is a tidy piece of change, and was clearly a big bet by the family on Kubrick's future.
Maybe others around.
I'm going to get some of that stew first.
Sidney, better grab something to eat. Maybe a long time till our next feast. You better eat something.
It's very, very disturbing without being too graphic, but you can see through camera angles, through close-ups, through the way he actually manipulates the actors to express what's going on, that there's something really nasty going on there. He's also particularly good at real death, at showing dead bodies. They're not just sort of dead bodies, they're not just actors lying on the ground. They actually look like corpses. So already you can see the mark of a man who is thinking visually. He's thinking visually. He wants to make sure that whatever he's got on the screen is going to have the impact intellectually and viscerally that he really wants.
Frankly, I still become uneasy when I find myself trapped, directing the courses of frightened men. I cannot quite admit that it is I who am creating slaughter in this abyss. So that I left the road. So that I ordered this or that. I'm trapped. What is a prison for me, I make a grave for others.
To your health, sir.
Fear and Desire was not a commercial success, but Kubrick was able to bounce back quickly with his second feature, Killer's Kiss.
Brings together two very game boys. The youngster, undefeated in 22 professional encounters, Kid Rodriguez, and the veteran, Davy Gordon, who's emerged victorious in 88 fights while losing 9 and drawing 2. Gordon's long career, he's now 29, has been one long promise without fulfillment, at least thus far. As hard a puncher as they come, a clever boxer, he's been plagued by a weak chin and the unlucky knack of being at his worst for the big one. And tonight is a big one indeed, with a title bout in the offing for the winner.
Next, Kubrick decides to make a kind of boxing film because that was sort of all the rage then in that time. He gets his family's money again, and he does Killer's Kiss, which is known for the shots that he does in the old Pennsylvania station, old Penn station, incredible shots. But the industry started to watch how he was using the camera. He was creating atmosphere with the camera itself. The movie studios were looking for new talent because they were being threatened now by television. People weren't coming out of their houses anymore to go to movie palaces and see the movie theaters. So the movie companies were desperate. They needed to find new talent, so they're keeping his eye on him, even though this film was not a thing that made a lot of money for anybody, but it showed his talent, it showed what he was and the possibilities of him.